Okay, good morning, and thanks for joining me today for a slice of some strategy thinking. And this month we're going to be looking at new ventures. A lot of times I also talk about that as innovation. They're all kind of tied together. So we'll get into a little bit of innovation too, but it's the focus that the people in the program that decided this wanted was on new ventures. This is a slice of the content that will be covering tomorrow in the Strategic Leader Program, which is a training and coaching program for a group training and coaching program for CEOs, owners, and executives of second stage companies, smaller companies. So I take some of the content and I'm going to go over it with you as a sample of what the kinds of things that we cover. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll give you a little bit of background about me. We'll talk about strategy and some background on that. Then we'll look at a couple of concepts for new ventures, and then I'll share with you how you can learn more if you're interested in participating in those programs. So let's get right into it. For those of you who aren't familiar with Phimation, a lot of people know pi as the ratio of circles. Phi is the ratio of spirals. It's actually 1.614 and goes on and on and on. And so you see phi showing up all over the universe as the way that it's able to grow, both functioning currently and expanding. So phimation is the process of growth that is all around us, that occurs in the natural world, and it's the way that the universe balances structure and creativity at the same time. If you're managing a small company, that probably resonates as the process that you're going through, and that's why we chose it as the name. And it's very representative of the work that we do and the process that our clients go through with us. A little bit about me. I work from the board level down to the kind of middle manager level. But most of my work is in the chief operating officer, 1 foot in day-to-day operations, 1 foot in strategy, or at the board level. What that means is that I care about where we're going and what the bigger picture is, but I also care that there's something that we need to do in alignment with that in the next week or day. So that gives a whole range of practicality and also kind of broader thinking. Do have about 20 active clients, so at this point I'm drawing from a number of different situations and environments. Been doing this for about 15 years now. But let's talk a little bit about strategy background. I know some of you have been in this before and you've seen it, but I think it's really important kind of baseline for us to understand. And I like working with these grids. I think they are able to show us some things in very simple ways. So on the vertical axis here, you have how familiar is the situation that you're in. So this chart is going to show us that there are actually different strategy approaches that are appropriate depending on your situation. So the question is, what's your situation? So on the vertical axis is familiarity, and it's reverse, so that if it's highly familiar, that's low, and if it's unfamiliar, that's high. That's high up on the chart. And then on the horizontal axis is complexity. So how complicated is this situation or the decision that you need to make about the situation? If it's if it's very simple, then it's to the left, and if it's very complicated, it's to the right. So we spend most of our time in the lower left quadrant. And in that quadrant, we can make very good intuitive decisions. They're not very complicated, and we've seen these kind of situations before. The challenge comes when we are up in the upper right-hand corner, so we haven't been in that environment before, or it's a very complicated situation. And when we're dealing with that kind of situation, it's important that it be more structured, that the process of making decisions, the process of understanding what's going on, of setting the strategy, be more structured. And then, of course, you get a balance of the other two quadrants there, where you need to have some intuition is okay, but you also should build in some structure. So most of my work with my clients, I'm very good at not getting into the intuitive part and identifying those. With the intuitive area, you want to make those decisions as quickly as possible so they don't take a lot of resources. that conserves your resources of decision making and investment and things like that for the rest of the quadrants, and especially the upper right quadrant, where you're going to have to kind of spend a disproportionate amount of time thinking and understanding, assessing, and deciding. The tools that I use and that I built up with my clients are designed for a very small company, so it's not about some analysis paralysis, but for a small company, how do you make a structured decision without losing the speed and agility and flexibility and things like that? Hopefully you'll see that in the slice that I share with you on New Ventures. So your job as an executive is to understand where are we in this situation, and then act accordingly. And I will say that most of the money that you will look back on and say, I wasted it or I made a mistake and that was very costly, most of the time that's because you were actually in the upper right quadrant. It was more unfamiliar than you realized, and it was more complicated than you realized, and you were acting as if you were in the lower left quadrant. That is where we waste most of the money in our organization, is when we just simply misjudge the complexity and the familiarity of the environment. What kinds of things do we find up in the upper right? Any transitions, accelerations, kind of changed marketplaces, and then anytime something's new, it's going to be less familiar, and who knows if it's going to be more complicated. But if you're dealing with new markets, new functions, new approaches in your business, it probably is also more complex than it looks on the surface. So that's your job as an executive. That's going on all the time. You need to use the right strategy approach. There are some things that are happening in the marketplace, though, that are actually impacting this and making that need for you to understand that and manage that even more important. And to understand that, what's happening out in society, we need to look at this framework. Strategy is really about making choices, and choices about making decisions. If you look at what a decision is made up of, it has two components: the options that we have to choose from, and then the criteria that we're going to use to evaluate those options. So a decision is simply, the simple formula is, if I have a decision to make, I have options times the criteria to evaluate those options. If you want to make better decisions, come up with more options, because you're only as good as the options that you have. So more options. If you want to get better decisions, come up with clearer criteria. Get clearer on what's important and how you're going to evaluate it. All right, so that is how decisions get made. The thing that we have going on in society now is that there are forces that are impacting all three of those dimensions of decision making. So disruption means that industries that hadn't changed for a decade or 2 decades now are changing, and leadership teams are having to make decisions about things that they didn't have to make decisions about. So I have a client that used the yellow pages for decades. They can't use the yellow pages anymore. That was a formula that worked. Now they don't have the formula that worked. They have to make a decision there where they never had to make a decision before. In fact, that one decision of use the yellow pages or not has really become probably half a dozen decisions to understand what should we do. Because it's not just like, oh, well, should we be on the web or not? There are a lot of other options. Which brings us to options. So there is now an abundance of options for us to consider that we didn't have to consider, and those are just making it harder for us to actually go through our decision making. We're so overwhelmed with options that we don't know where to start. And then the last is the uncertainty that's in the environment. If we knew that we could be profitable next year, if we knew what that profitability would be, then we could invest, or we could set a strategy along one course. But because we're not sure about that, now it throws up in the air, well, what should the criteria be? Should the criteria be we want to be healthy in 5 years? Or should the criteria be we need to be profitable next quarter? Because we can follow either one of those, but one of those is kind of more right than the other, and we have to understand how to evaluate them. So as a leader, you have that grid that I was talking about, where you have intuitive versus versus structured, and then you have these societal forces that are just putting way more pressure than you ever had before on this decision making and this strategy. And what that looks like is this. You know, the white part of this chart is the old days and kind of the landscape that you'd be operating in. There's this whole new normal that is way less familiar to us and way more complicated than we had to deal with historically. And of course, upper right, that means that things have to get more structured. So my general advice to you is that you probably need more structure in your strategy process than you have been putting toward it. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know where or how or anything like that, but just in general, most companies are not having as much structured conversations as they need to. All right, so with that backdrop, then let's look at a couple of tools that we can use to understand one part of the decision making that you may be faced with as a business owner and how to launch new ventures. So I'm going to show two slides. The first is the overview. So, and I call this opportunity management. So opportunity management is like we could go in a lot of different directions. How do we make sure that we're doing that in a disciplined way? And a lot of times small companies have been very good at shooting from the hip, and when they're faced with a number of opportunities, they don't have the muscle to manage that very effectively. So there's three components to it. The first is actually for each opportunity, there is a framework to develop that opportunity. And a lot of you may have heard of stage gate process. You know, this is just saying, how do we, because it's an opportunity with a lot of uncertainty, how do we manage that so that we are managing our risk and managing our investment and doing that in a diligent way? So that's the first, is we have to, for each individual opportunity, for each individual new venture, we need to manage it effectively. On top of that, then, is the portfolio of the opportunities. We need to make sure that we're allocating our resources to the more attractive opportunities, more to the more attractive opportunities and less to the less attractive opportunities. And then the last piece is integrating these new ventures into our core business. One of the frequent mistakes that I see made at my clients is they'll take somebody that's been operating a part of the business in their core, part of their core business, and they'll say, all right, well, you're in charge of this new venture now. The skill sets that are required for launching a new venture and managing something that's already going are very different, which doesn't mean that people can't make the change, but it does, if we go back to our chart here, what it says is that the danger of taking a core person and putting them into a new venture is that they think that they can make intuitive decisions, and they actually are in a situation that's more unfamiliar to them than they realize, and it's more complicated than they realize. They assume that they can use some of the rules that they already have from their core business work, and that's not a good assumption. All right, so the three pieces are: each new venture needs to be managed effectively. We need to manage the overall portfolio of new ventures, and then we need to make sure that we are developing taking our resources from the core business and using them effectively. And then as the new venture develops, that we're able to integrate that into our core business. Now, one option is to just spin it off and not integrate it. But most of the time that we're doing a new venture, we want to pull that back into the core mothership. And there's some complication to doing that, or there's some best practices to doing that effectively. So again, to just kind of give you a slice of the kinds of, so tomorrow in the session, we're going to look at all three of those and talk about not only the framework for how to think about those three elements, but also what are some tips and some tools to manage those effectively. I just took the first one of development management. How do we develop a new venture? And I want to do the high level view of what the 5 phases are. So phase 0 is simply the idea and generating the idea. It actually, even though there's not really any resources going to it, it's important to recognize that there's a phase 0 that's ideas. And typically you'd want to have maybe a dozen different ideas going. And then the question is, of those dozen, which of them do I actually invest in and start to move down the line? All right, from idea, then phase one is innovation, which is really about the technical development. Now I have service clients and technical doesn't really work for them. It's about developing that new offering, but there's some kind of usually new structuring, new thinking, new development that needs to happen in order to actually provide it. And so there's some kind of innovation that needs to happen. If you're in a technical field, that would be in the technical part of the development. But if you're not in a technical field, there's just kind of development that needs to happen around that product or around that service, just simply being able to offer it. And then on the market side, you want to do some initial view of market feasibility. So this is probably a half a dozen conversations. I'm not a big fan of, in the book, market research. I found that for a small company that's mostly irrelevant. What's way more relevant is what kind of relationships do you have in the marketplace, and what do those relationships say to you about the idea that you have. So that's phase one, and at the end of phase one, you'd say, what have we learned? Does it seem like this deserves continued time and energy to invest it or not? If it does, then you probably have a next level down of innovation, of kind of the technical development to do. And then the market feasibility morphs into market development. And to me, the difference is that in market development, you're now having conversations that they are under the guise of market research, but they're actually pre-sales conversations with people that you're hoping will be your initial customers. So can we get people to a place where they're indicating interest in buying? And we want to be doing that at the same time we're doing the technical development. So because that's going to give us good signals about whether this is worthwhile or not. So I want to be trying to move at least 3, maybe 6. I mean, if I'm thinking of a B2B B2B kind of thing. If I'm doing a consumer thing, or it's more something that's a broad mass market, then I'm looking for a dozen, 2 dozen. Just can I get some indication that people are going to be willing to buy this? So at the end of phase 2, there's another decision of like, have we gotten this far enough from an innovation perspective that it works? And then have we also seen enough in the marketplace that it deserves us to push it forward? If we get both of those, now we're going to start to develop the business. That means that we're going to allocate some people or people time to it in a meaningful way. It's not just a project anymore. Our focus is actually in developing the business. And we want to prove that we can have a business at a small scale that is profitable, or that we can see the path to profitability very clearly, that we kind of know how that model works. At the end of phase 3, at the end of business development, I want to kind of know what the levers are that we can pull that will end up with a profitable business as we operate it. And so then phase 4 is, now that we know that there's something there on a sustainable basis, how do we integrate that back into our main operation, and how do we scale it up? And then there's kind of like I have a playbook or a guidebook for each one of those phases. There are different activities. You can break it down kind of very simply into what you would need to do to prove market feasibility, what you need to do market development activities. So those are a couple of frameworks. What we're not covering today is portfolio management, which is really interesting, especially if you're on a leadership team. How do we make sure that we're allocating things to the right place? And then that last part of making sure that we're integrating it effectively. If you don't integrate it into your business effectively, what you'll find is that you're either wasting R&D resources and spending too much development, overdeveloping it without the return, or that you're selling it too early and you have delivery problems. All right, so again, this is coming from the Strategic Leader Program, which is coming from my consulting playbook. So I do my consulting work, and then I share part of that with the people in the Strategic Leader Program, and we have one of those tomorrow. Let me just talk about and so for those of you that are on the call, if you want to participate tomorrow, you can, and I'll tell you how, but we'll send you the summary of the webinar. So for each one of these webinars that we have every month with the Strategic Leader Program, we do a very comprehensive summary of what were the questions that were asked, what's a simple bullet point, quick ideas of what happened. So for those of you on this webinar as the slice, you'll get the recording of it. If you actually want to participate and ask questions and things like that, there is a $100 starter kit that has 3 months of that Strategic Leader Program, as many people as you want in the company to participate. There's also a Rising Leader Program, which is for high potential middle managers, folks that are going to be your future leaders, and that happens a week later every month, and we have a different topic, and they're usually a little more practical, but they also get into some of these executive issues because these developing leaders want to know what's kind of in their future. And then at the top of this slide, there's a guidebook that I've written that's kind of like a field guide. It's a very practical guide to owning a business. It covers 12 different, owning a small business covers 12 different areas. And then I have a toolkit of like those decision grids and some templates and things like that that I found to be useful in my consulting. That's part of that kit too. So if you're interested in that, you can contact Allison in my office. You'll see the contact information there. It's just Allison at Phimation. And that's if you want to participate tomorrow or you want to talk about the starter kit. If you just want to see what it's like, then you'll be getting the summary in your email. And you know, you'll be able to see what the areas that I didn't talk about here, the portfolio management and the business integration, you'll get that in the summary it should show up early next week sometime. All right, so that's the content that I have to cover today. If again, in Strategic Leader Program, we get into a lot of Q&A, conversation, either even peer learning, kind of peer-to-peer learning. But for today, it's just to give you a sense of where we're headed with that. Every month we set the topic differently, just depends on what the strategic leader folks want to talk about. So next month we'll be covering something different, and I hope you'll join us again then if you're interested. And of course, hope you join me tomorrow if you're interested in learning more about this. All right, thanks again for your time today, and look forward to talking to you again in the future. Bye.